Well, of course, that begs a difficult question, Peter, because if ordinary people are aware of it, why are they doing nothing about it to a large extent? You know, it's like comfort kills. No, we're not having a dialogue yet. I'm a bit like, I concur with most of the panel that, the biggest driving elements are internal rather than external. I think when things from outside happen and come as a shock to certain analysts, it's simply because they have failed to notice what changes on a day-to-day basis in their own domestic environment right under their nose, and they would rather attribute challenges to, if it's not foreigners, at least foreign ideologies such as Marxism or Islamism or wokeism, which they often see as coming from the United States rather than necessarily having some traction in this country. I could give you countless examples. I will just pick one from the area of security, and then I'll talk a little bit about community. A friend of mine used to tell the story of having visited her elderly professor at a university, and that professor now feels hamstrung by rules and procedures to the point that he can't discipline students anymore, let alone teach, and has to be careful what he researches. She noticed that at the back of the class, many students were surfing the internet, sending out tweets, not really giving it their full attention. He told her afterwards it's very difficult to get them to write essays. You can't expect them to memorize texts like you used to in the past. Same evening, she went to that university's Islamic Society meeting, and she saw many of the same students who were now handing over their iPhones and laptops to the imam running the class, who was expecting them to memorize the Quran inside out and back to front. And she then asks the question, so who's the radicalizing influence here? Is it the imam who's feeding hungry young minds in search of guidance and direction? Or is it the jaded Western professor unable to impart meaning to his students, who are actually actively searching for something to believe in and belong to? And it's not just in this arena of kind of security issues that I deal with mostly, but also in everyday culture that you see this. Real community is forged through acts of loyalty to a nation, to a culture, to people who you have a sense of belonging with and sharing some beliefs with. The American writer Matthew Crawford gave a great example of this in one of his recent Substacks, where he talked about he inadvertently turned into the wrong driveway when he was trying to go to a shopping mall in Los Angeles. And there was a frisson of nervousness about what that might mean. He saw a woman at the front of the driveway, and he kind of tried, he kind of thought, I could probably communicate easily with this. I'll make a joke about it. And he said, oh, you must see this a lot, idiots like me. And she laughed. And he said how refreshing it was to be able to have a very simple interaction with someone who understood that it was a joke, it was self-effacement, it was a mistake. And he says, the problem is we don't feel at home in our own backyards anymore. There's a lack of common ground with other people to the point where we don't risk making a joke or using irony, or definitely not double entendre. Nobody feels at home because people are quite literally foreigners to one another. Olivier Roy, a French thinker, in his latest book, Culture in Crisis, which is much better described in French as the flattening of the world, suggests that we now talk almost like the recipient of our speech is autistic. If you look up on Wikipedia, there's a page designed to tell you how to teach or talk to an autistic person. It says, use specific keywords, repeating and stressing them, pause between words and phrases to give the person time to process. Don't use too many questions, and use less non-verbal communication such as gestures and facial expressions. And he says, we're kind of like living, if any of you have received training in your organization recently, you will recognize that that's what most of the trainers speak to you like. And Crawford concludes there's simply less pleasure in being out and about. I'll finish with just a little point about Robert Putnam. Some of you all know of Robert Putnam, who's a professor at the John F. Kennedy School at Harvard, from his great work almost 30 years ago now, looking at the demise or the erosion of social capital, which he wrote up first as a paper in 1995, Bowling Alone, and then as a book of the same name. He's less known for the work he did afterwards. And that's because the work he did afterwards was investigating the effects of diversity. And he didn't like what he was finding. He said, in the short term, other things being equal, by which he meant accounting for income inequality and crime rates, more diversity in a community is associated with less trust, both among and within each of the groups. And he delayed publication of his work. He actually had the data in 2001 and didn't produce a paper about it until 2007, when he felt he could develop proposals to compensate for those negative effects. He says he tried to embellish it as in the long run, immigration and diversity are important culturally and economically, but in the long run. I just want to finish on one point, because I know Jacob.
Concluding sentence.
Presumably, what he's missing is the need to integrate people.
All right, we'll stop at that, Bill.
But my question to you is, integrate into what? If we no longer know what we stand for.
We'll leave it there. We'll get into it. Good. Great. Thank you, Bill.